let me turn now to Russia, which may be the first example, or certainly the biggest example that I can think of a country that started with a totalitarian, or in its later days, authoritarian government, passed out of that into a form of democracy, and maybe passing right out the other side back into authoritarianism and maybe totalitarianism. Freedom of the press is going down, freedom of political activity is going down, control of both the media and the economy largely are being re-centralized in the Kremlin. Russians today still refer to the leader in the Kremlin, as they did under communism and under the czars, as the boss, as in Putin, the boss wants X, Y, or Z, so of course they're going to do it. I think we can see in Russia's increased belligerence in the space of the former Soviet Union, where they are clearly seeking a return of a hegemony, if not reunification, that the direction of Russian policy, while certainly not communist in the sense we understood it, may be best described as a reversion to Russia of the 19th century and before, is entirely comfortable with centralized control over both politics and the economy. This may be an example of democracy lasting 10 or 15 years, depending on how you measure it, between large periods of authoritarian rule. And I don't know many who are really optimistic about Russia going forward. Let's take China as another example. A system under the communists, the most authoritarian, I think, in the world during that period, capping a century of unrelieved turmoil and conflict inside China, beginning at the beginning of the 20th century with the collapse of the last Chinese dynasty. We have heard for years now, really decades, that China's opening up, that it's making progress, it's becoming a freer society, much of which is based on what has happened to the Chinese economy. And to be sure, central control there has diminished. There are possibilities for private entrepreneurship and investment domestically and internationally, but there has been essentially no relaxation of political control from the center. For at least 25 years now, I've been reading about how wonderful local elections are in China, where the cadres get together and they elect the village leader, and that inevitably this is going to spread throughout China and you'll have a democratic competitive system at the national level. Okay, so you say 25 years, look, in a culture that's lasted 6 millennia, don't be in a hurry. I think 25 years is a pretty long time where the idea of popular sovereignty would begin to catch on a little bit more. And some would say, well, you know, it did catch on a little bit more right up until June of 1989 in Tiananmen Square, when the People's Liberation Army voted on what it thought about increased political liberty. Which I think remains essentially the situation today. The Communist Party is the dominant political force in China, without question. And within the structure of the Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army remains the dominant political force. Chairmanship of the Central Military Commission is the real locus of power inside China. And that doesn't appear to be getting ready to change. So while a lot of people talk internationally about the peaceful rise of China, as in that wonderful phrase that it will be a responsible stakeholder in world affairs, I don't see that as inevitable at all, nor do I see it as a place where foreigners are necessarily treated equally and there's opportunity to make money. You can see now in recent reports by the U.S. and European chambers of commerce in Hong Kong and Beijing evidence of increased discrimination against foreign investment. At the same time, you can see evidence of China's increasing military buildup, its extension of claims in the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, its acquisition of blue water naval capabilities. This remains an extraordinarily centralized and highly controlled governmental system, and one that I think is becoming increasingly threatening to American interest. Let's take a couple of smaller cases. Let's take North Korea, for example. Here is a state that is essentially a prison camp. That's the easiest way to understand it. It controls everything. It has been sanctioned internationally for decades, and yet it possesses nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons that have intimidated its near neighbors to the point of near impotence. How poor is North Korea? This poor. From the time of partition in 1945 until today, when both North and South started equally poor. In fact, the North was better off because it had more of the industrial capacity. Until today, we find that the average North Korean is 4 to 6 inches shorter than the average South Korean, and that the weight differential is comparable. Now, this is a society that both during the Bush and Obama administrations, we have been saying, you know, we can help you with the economic betterment of your country if you'll only give up your nuclear weapons. What could we possibly have been thinking? To say that to a government that doesn't care that its population is literally shrinking so that it can keep nuclear weapons, I mean, that is squeezing just about everything you can out of your population, literally, in a centralized government. So when I hear, as I say, the utilitarian argument in favor of individual freedom, if you're Kim Jong-il, utilitarianism works his way. Iran, you have a theocracy that since 1979, since the Islamic Revolution, has turned the country into close to an economic basket case, and yet is within a very short period of time itself of getting nuclear weapons. The Obama administration, as the Bush administration, talks always about the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Republic of Iran. How sweet. Forgetting that the first word of Islamic reflects the Ayatollah Khomeini's notion that Iran is governed by jurisprudence that comes directly from Allah. And, you know, this is what theocratic rule means, and increasingly militarized theocratic rule as the Revolutionary Guards take control. You know, if the law comes from God, and the only people who can really understand it are the mullahs, are you really going to have a vote on whether you agree or disagree with God? I mean, this idea that we're going to have free and fair elections in Iran under that kind of theocratic system is just naive, to say the least. And let's look at my favorite in Latin America, Hugo Chavez. Here's a man who's conducting a slow-motion coup in Venezuela. It's taken him 10 years to get to this point of manipulating elections. He's a sort of kinder and gentler version of Fidel Castro. He didn't do it all at once. He's doing it slowly, but Venezuela continues to sink under this increasingly centralized control, and he poses a threat not only to U.S. interest in the region because of his ties with Russia and Iran, especially on nuclear matters, but in threats to the fragile democracies elsewhere in Latin America. He's interfered in the elections in Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru. He supports the FARC narco-terrorists in Colombia. This again is an economy that has incredible riches, but which are being diverted to the purpose of maintaining Chavez and the military in power. And yet, as long as oil stays the price that it is on international markets, the implications, the utilitarian implications for the Venezuelan people are not going to slow Chavez down at all. And then, of course, there's Al-Qaeda, the ultimate libertarian organization. It's not even a state at all. And yet they are able to threaten and carry out terrorist organizations all around the world. Now, that is simply a quick run-through of some of the threats we face from people who don't believe history has ended, who don't follow the Washington Consensus, who aren't wild about markets and individual liberty, and who do pose problems of one sort or another for the United States and our friends around the world. Now, what about the United States itself? I think we've still got here in this country the most libertarian country in the world. Not perfectly so, not more in every single aspect than any other country, but nonetheless one where we do prize individual liberty and initiative more than in the aggregate than any other place in the world. Consider, for example, the following. Would you think about having the United States and any other country vote together to merge the two countries, as the Europeans seem bent on doing? Suppose all of the provinces of Canada were admitted to the United States as states. Not going to happen, obviously, but just suppose it. What do you think the balance in the Senate would be today? Pretty frightening, if you want my opinion, with all due respect to our friends in Canada. So when you hear the international left and the left in this country saying things like, you know, we've got global problems today, and global problems require global solutions. So we need to get past these antiquated notions of national sovereignty, and we need to look at solutions that get you to pooled sovereignty or shared sovereignty. What they are saying fundamentally is you Americans have too much control over your government. And what you really need is to share a little bit of that with us. Now, I think most Americans don't think we have enough control over our government, even after last Tuesday's election, so that they recognize that this idea of pooling or sharing sovereignty it is very directly an impingement on their authority as citizens, and that the removal of sovereignty, even from as distant a place as Washington to an even more distant place, is something that will only work to their detriment. So that's why I think ideas like the International Criminal Court or a number of proposals that were being discussed at Copenhagen to deal with climate change, or a whole range of other issues that are out there, are something that, although they've been rebuffed by the United States in the short term, are very much going to be on the international agenda going forward. And I think the risk in the next 2 years, in particular with Obama gridlocked at home domestically, I hope, because of these elections, he will turn his attention internationally, or just coincidentally, of course, he's traveling now, and think that this might be a way to achieve some of the aims that he's not going to be able to get domestically. So what do we conclude from all this? Number one, the economy, with almost any kind of market basis to it, creates such enormous potential for deadweight loss that governments around the world have a lot of room to do very foolish and dangerous things, and given the chance, they usually do. For totalitarian regimes, the lessons that they should have learned from the last century are: don't attack your enemies too early or too often. If you're just a little bit more patient, you might have a better chance to succeed. And then third and finally, I think the most important lesson of the last century is don't mess with the United States. Now, that's a pretty good rule, although not a sufficient rule. There have been conflicts, although we won the headline 3 world wars, conflicts where we did not prevail, usually because we did it to ourselves. We didn't fight to a stalemate in Korea. We stopped after the Chinese intervention halfway up the Korean peninsula, essentially voluntarily. We obviously did it to ourselves in Vietnam. I would argue we did it to ourselves in the first Persian Gulf War by not overthrowing Saddam Hussein. But the big question, I think, today going forward is whether this third rule, don't mess with the United States, still applies. And as happy as I am about last Tuesday's election, this battle is far from over. It is still a jump ball over the direction of the United States, both in our domestic policy and internationally. And if the time comes around the world where people don't worry about messing with the United States, not only is the rest of the world going to be in worse shape, we're going to be in a lot worse shape too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'm sure there will be some questions. We have a little bit of time, so please go to the microphone.